Hello, you're watching movie snapshot scenes, and this is the summary of Manchester by the Sea. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Shadows of the past. In the bitter cold of Quincy, Massachusetts, Lee Chandler moved through life like a ghost among the living. He worked as a janitor, quiet, efficient, and detached. Whether unclogging toilets or shoveling snow, he spoke little and avoided eye contact. Those who encountered him saw a man wrapped in silence, someone weighed down by a sorrow too heavy for words. His life was a daily routine of isolation, a self-imposed exile that kept the world at arm's length. But there had been another Lee once. Years earlier, Lee had lived in Manchester by the Sea, a small coastal New England town where he had a home, a wife, and 3 children. The ocean breeze and fishing boats, the quiet rhythm of coastal life. He had been part of it all. He laughed, he drank with friends, he took his kids ice fishing. That life felt like a distant dream now, one that had dissolved into ash and memory. So, call came on a regular morning, unexpected and jarring. Joe Chandler, Lee's older brother, had died of a sudden heart attack. He'd been sick for a while, heart failure, the doctors said. But still, it hit Lee like a blow. Not just because of the loss, but because it meant going back to the place he had run from, back to the town where everyone remembered what happened. Reluctantly, Lee traveled to Manchester to take care of the arrangements. The sea looked the same, the streets were the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. It was like stepping into a painting of a life he no longer belonged to. At the reading of the will, Lee was hit with something he hadn't expected. Joe had named him as the legal guardian of his 16-year-old son, Patrick. Lee froze. Patrick was a bright, sarcastic, hockey-playing teenager who loved girls, band practice, and driving Joe's old boat. He had friends, a life, a rhythm of his own. The last thing Lee expected or wanted was to become a guardian, a father figure again. The wound of his past loss was still open, and now he was being asked to care for someone else's child. Lee struggled to make sense of it. Why had Joe chosen him? Didn't he know Lee couldn't handle this? But there was no way around it. Patrick needed someone, and Lee was all he had left. So began a reluctant reunion, not just with Patrick, but with the town, the people, and most of all, with the unbearable memories Lee had buried deep beneath his grief. Lee never wanted to be anyone's savior, let alone a guardian. The idea of taking care of Patrick, a sharp-tongued, quick-witted teenager with a full schedule and complicated emotions, felt overwhelming. Lee had spent years building emotional walls so high that even he couldn't see over them. Now, suddenly, he was expected to be responsible for a young man who barely knew how to grieve. Patrick, on the other hand, wasn't looking for a replacement father. He didn't cry at the funeral, didn't break down. He seemed almost too composed, keeping busy with school, hockey, his band rehearsals, and texting multiple girlfriends. His emotional armor was different from Lee's. It was distraction, but underneath, he was scared and uncertain, and he didn't know how to say it. Their first days together were awkward, even tense. Lee tried to manage the logistics, cooking meals, organizing Patrick's schedule, dealing with the endless small tasks Joe had left behind, but emotionally, he was absent. Patrick wanted to stay in Manchester. His friends, his team, his life were all there. But Lee was already suffocating just being back. The idea of staying permanently reopened every wound he had tried to cauterize. When Lee visited the school to talk with Patrick's teachers or tried to coordinate practice times, he did so mechanically. He wasn't prepared for parenthood. He wasn't even functioning properly as a person. The shadows of his past began to creep back in. Old neighbors who gave him quiet, pitying stares, whispered rumors that followed him wherever he went, and then came the panic attack. One day, while opening a freezer filled with food, Lee was suddenly overtaken by a violent rush of grief. The frozen air reminded him of that night. The night he lost everything. The house fire, the unbearable, irreversible mistake that stole his children from him. It had been ruled an accident, but Lee had sentenced himself to a lifetime of punishment. Patrick found him on the floor, shaking, breathless, unable to explain. But Patrick didn't pry. He didn't need to. Even in his youth, he understood the look of a man broken beyond repair. Their bond grew slowly, not through big emotional speeches, but in the silences, in car rides, in grocery store arguments, in moments of shared pain neither of them could express with words. They were two people trapped in grief, trying to function in a world that moved on without them. Lee wasn't ready to be a guardian, but maybe, just maybe, he could be there, not as a hero, but as someone who stayed. Life in Manchester by the sea moved on, but for Lee, every corner of the town was haunted. The dock where he used to tie up his fishing boat, the liquor store where he bought beer before long nights by the fire, the hilltop road where the snow would pile so deep he'd carry his children on his back. Each location was a reminder, vivid and cruel, of everything he had lost. Still, he tried to hold it together. For Patrick, for the responsibility he never asked for. But inside, he was fraying. Patrick, for his part, seemed to be managing just fine on the surface. He balanced school, hockey, and his chaotic social life with surprising ease. He argued with Lee about mundane things, freezer space, bedtimes, girlfriends, but there was no malice, just the normal friction of two very different people forced together. In fact, Patrick even started showing signs of warming to Lee, though he'd never say it out loud, but grief has a way of finding the cracks. One night, Patrick's suppressed pain finally broke through. While rummaging through the freezer, he was struck by the sight of the frozen meat inside. Just like Lee earlier, he too had a breakdown, sobbing, panicked, unable to explain. The food reminded him that his father's body was still in a freezer at the morgue, awaiting burial. The permanence of death hit him like a wave. Lee tried to console him, but words failed him, as they always did. All he could do was sit beside Patrick and let the silence speak for them both. They were two men, one young, one ruined, united, not by blood, but by loss. As days passed, Lee was forced to revisit pieces of his former life, often against his will. He ran into old friends, people who once knew him as a loving father and husband. He avoided their eyes. Their sympathy felt like knives. And then came the hardest reunion of all, Randy. Lee's ex-wife, the woman he once loved with everything he had, was now remarried and pregnant. Their encounter on the street was hesitant, strained, painful. Randy apologized for the way she treated him after the tragedy, for the things she said in her rage and sorrow. She told him she didn't blame him anymore, but Lee couldn't accept the forgiveness. His guilt was too deeply rooted. He told her gently, but firmly, that he couldn't move on. Not now, not ever. He was still the man who had failed, and no, new life could undo that. In Manchester, the past wasn't a shadow behind them. It was a weight they carried every step of the way. There's a moment in every life when everything changes, and for Lee Chandler, that moment had long since passed, but its ashes still clung to him. The truth of Lee's past was something people in Manchester spoke of in hushed voices, behind doors and across bars. But for Patrick, and for the audience, it was only now that the full weight of it came to light. One night, after a long day filled with awkward routines and quiet grief, Lee sat alone with a bottle. The silence of the room pressed in. His mind drifted, as it often did, back to the life before. He had been happy once. He had lived in a modest house with his wife Randy and their 3 small children. Their days were filled with warmth, chaos, and laughter. He and his friends would drink late into the night, the kids tucked safely in their rooms. But one night, after a party, Lee stumbled out to buy more beer. He left a fire burning in the fireplace. A simple mistake. One careless moment. The fire spread fast. By the time he returned, it was too late. Flames engulfed the house. The air was filled with smoke and screams and sirens. Lee tried to run inside, but the firefighters held him back. He watched helplessly as everything he loved, his 3 children, was taken from him. The guilt became a permanent scar. It wasn't just grief, it was self-hatred. He had survived what he believed he didn't deserve to survive. He and Randy never recovered. She blamed him. So did he. Eventually she left, and he accepted it without resistance. He left Manchester, not because he wanted to, but because staying would have killed him slowly. The scene of the fire is shown with quiet horror. No dramatic music, no melodrama. Just the raw, brutal truth of an ordinary man who made a tragic mistake. When Patrick began asking questions, Lee didn't want to talk, but the past was no longer something he could bury. So, piece by piece, the truth came out. Patrick didn't recoil, he didn't judge, he simply listened. And in that, something unspoken passed between them. Patrick realized that Lee's silence wasn't coldness, it was pain. Every effort Lee made, no matter how small or clumsy, was a desperate attempt to hold together a life, shattered, beyond repair. The town hadn't forgotten. Neither had Lee, but maybe Patrick was starting to understand. The fire that destroyed Lee's life hadn't gone out. It still burned inside him, quiet, constant, but now at least, someone else could see the smoke. The days in Manchester grew colder, and with them came the inevitability of a decision. Joe Chandler's will had made it clear Lee was to become Patrick's legal guardian, but despite the slow progress of their relationship, Lee couldn't do it. Not fully. Not in this town. Patrick didn't understand at first. To him, things had settled into a rhythm. Lee was showing up. He wasn't perfect, but he was there. They argued like family, ate like family, even laughed sometimes. Patrick believed it could work. He wanted to stay in Manchester, keep playing hockey, keep living in the only world he'd ever known. But Lee was unraveling in silence. Each day in that town peeled open the wounds he had tried to keep sealed. Every face, every street, every morning was a cruel reminder of the fire, of the night he forgot to put the screen in the fireplace, of the moment he returned home to see flames devouring everything, of the children he couldn't save, and the house he had built with his own hands, now reduced to ashes. He couldn't stay, not because he didn't care about Patrick, but because he was broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. The past didn't visit him occasionally, it lived with him. Manchester was a place where forgiveness was possible, but not self-forgiveness. And without that, the future had no space to grow. One evening, Lee took Patrick aside and said what he hadn't been able to for months. "I can't beat it. I can't stay." The words hung in the air like frost. But Patrick, older than his years, didn't explode. He didn't cry. He simply nodded. Somewhere deep inside, he had always known. Lee was doing the best he could, and maybe that was enough. So a compromise was made. Patrick would stay in Manchester with another family, George and his wife, longtime friends of Joe's. Lee would move back to Quincy, but keep a spare room ready for visits, for weekends, for anything Patrick ever needed. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was honest. And sometimes, that's the best kind of love, too damaged. People can offer each other. Spring crept into Manchester by the sea with hesitant light and quiet change. The air had softened. The ocean breeze carried less bite. And yet, for Lee Chandler, the seasons did little to warm the weight he carried. There would be no sweeping transformation, no epiphany that erased grief. But there was motion, subtle, halting, human. Lee had made his decision. He was going back to Quincy, not in defeat, but in resignation, in honesty. He had tried, truly, quietly tried, to stay, for Patrick, for Joe's memory. But he couldn't. The town was a map of his personal ruin, and each street, each corner, each face echoed a past too loud to ignore. He hadn't healed. He wasn't sure he ever would. Patrick had taken the news with more grace than Lee expected. No screaming, no collapse, just that flicker of recognition in the boy's eyes, the realization that some people, no matter how hard they try, just can't outrun their ghosts. And that was okay. Pain didn't make someone unworthy of love. A plan was made. Patrick would stay in Manchester, living with George and his wife, longtime family friends who would keep him grounded. Lee, in turn, would move back to Quincy, but he promised something quietly powerful. He'd keep a spare room open. "For you," he told Patrick, "whenever you want." It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was real. In the days before his departure, they spent time doing what they'd grown used to, fishing, working on Joe's old boat, arguing about snacks, and riding in silence. These were their moments. No father-son proclamations, no emotional monologues, just the steady presence of two people who had learned how to carry their pain beside someone else. In one of their final conversations, Patrick asked if they could still go fishing together sometimes. Lee nodded. "Yeah, we'll go," he said, without hesitation. And in that small promise, there was a flicker of peace. On the day Lee left, Patrick walked him to the bus stop. The goodbye was quiet but heavy with meaning. No hugs, no tears, just an understanding that what they shared would not disappear with distance. Back in Quincy, Lee returned to his modest life, his small basement apartment, the quiet jobs, the shadowed routine. But now, something had changed. A thread had been rewoven into his life. It wasn't a fix. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. There would always be things Lee couldn't fix. He would never stop hearing the echoes of that fire. But in Patrick, he had found a reason to leave the door open, a reason to hold on, even if he couldn't move on, and so he kept a room ready, not for a miracle, but for possibility.